Um, we'll talk a little bit about the economy, what I think the implications are for the future of government. And in terms of the COVID-19 implications, one of the main points I want to make, and I'm going to start with, except that now my slide advance doesn't seem to be working either. Huh. Okay, the PowerPoint isn't working. I don't know what's gone wrong here. See if that will work. Okay, that will work. This is from a piece I wrote at the very beginning of the pandemic, that the future will in fact look rather like the recent past, just more so. I think this is a view that most of the commentariat has come to these days. But when the pandemic and the lockdowns first started, of course, the initial reaction was, there's a new normal that's completely different from the old normal, and the world will never be the same again. The world may never be the same again, but it's been going in the same direction it's been going for several years. And I just think what the effect of the pandemic has been to accelerate a lot of things that were going to happen over the next decade or two, some of which have happened within weeks, some of which will occur over the next, say, 6 to 10 years instead of 20 to 30 years. But basically, where we're headed is something that's been coming for quite a while, and it's basically due to the rise of digital technologies, and that will shape both the direction that the economy is going in the short term and the long term, and the direction that government has been going and will be going. I'm going to move through these slides pretty quickly because my last time trying this took me about 45 minutes to do what was intended to be a 20-minute presentation. So I'm going to condense a lot of things and try to move quickly. But I think most of this should be readily apparent and self-explainable to everybody on the call. The main thing I want to emphasize about what was happening in the economy and with government prior to COVID-19 basically flows out of the first item, which is that the world has been moving in a more virtual direction, less physical. By that I mean not just that the economy is becoming more weightless and intangible, but also this affects the nature of geography and the importance of place, and it downplays that. You can buy your product, you can obtain your workers, you can sell to customers all over the world, regardless of geography. And that's only becoming more so, and that's going to affect how we think about governments as well. But there's a point I'll make about that in a second, I'll come back to. But in terms of what that means for COVID-19, I've listed on the left here some of the changes, or some of the developments that we've seen during the course of the pandemic. These largely flow naturally out of the prior slide as to what was happening pre-pandemic. And these were some industry projections that I made early on. I'm putting this up largely to say that I have to have a certain amount of humility about this, because like most people, I guess I've been right about some things but wrong about some things, and I want to put up at the top something I was wrong about. In this early piece that I wrote about what was going to be the effect of the pandemic, one of the things I said was that there's going to be an increased demand for marriage counseling, because people being locked up in a house with each other for a long period of time would create a lot of stress. And in fact, we have seen that all over the world. Started in China almost immediately after the pandemic broke out. We're all over the world. You're seeing increased relationship failure, spiraling rates of domestic violence and things like that. On the other hand, I also thought that would lead to a lot of people in the same living space having much more convivial relationships and producing more babies. In fact, that it seems not to be true, and it appears that we'll have something of a baby bust. The rates of sexual activity apparently are going down all over the world, particularly amongst young people, because they're so depressed about the situation that we're living in nowadays. So this probably is not a good time to invest in Gerber baby food and diaper stocks. But so anyway, I was right on the marriage counseling side of things. We could spend time talking about all of these. I think a lot of them are self-explanatory. Again, I want to just say one thing about the point on the bottom, Tulsa versus San Francisco. The Tulsa in this list is not referring to the president's recent rally, but prior to COVID-19, Tulsa was, along with a lot of other small cities, but probably the leading one in making a real pitch to get young knowledge workers to move there by investing heavily in rehabbing downtown apartment space and building a lot of WeWork sort of co-working spaces, with the pitch that you don't have to live in San Francisco and pay exorbitant rents for everything. We may not be as exciting, but there's plenty of stuff to do. There's bars, there's theaters, there's places to hang out with friends, and you can work from Tulsa for Google. So why not? That was a pre-COVID-19 pitch that Tulsa was investing heavily in. It's obviously proven prescient now that Google has announced that they're going to kick half their workforce at least out of headquarters over the course of the next decade. So you're going to see young people moving out to the Tulsas and the Omahas and the small cities in Montana and so forth over the course of the next couple of years, which will get at least some of the economic activity and some of the people who are currently concentrated in a few major coastal cities, often in the interior, which will have long-lasting political ramifications as well. But to segue into the main point of my talk, this is a quote I like to use from Otto von Bismarck when we talk about government. For those of you who aren't German speakers, the line is, when the end of the world comes, I want to be in Mecklenburg because everything happens there 50 years later. And I like to use that as an example of government because I think you need to think about government as an industry that's going to be affected in the same ways as all particularly knowledge-based industries have been by technological development over the last generation. And that is that there will be the rise of new business models that we haven't thought of that will seriously undermine incumbents. It will give consumers a much wider range of choice. And the landscape will look very, very different 20 years from now in government, just like it looks in most industries today, with not just knowledge-based industries, with broadcasting, film, print, music, all being highly democratized and decentralized, but also the transportation industry, which is being transformed by Uber, lodging industry with Airbnb. You're going to see similar things happen in government. It's just the effect of the technology, like everything else, happens about 20 years later in government. In government, it's still pretty much cutting edge to think that the internet is going to give you fillable forms and better websites. But I think the effect on government is going to be much more profound, just as it has been in every other industry. And so that's what I'm going to spend most of the time today talking about. This slide summarizes, in the same way as some of the earlier slides, kind of what was happening in the government space before COVID-19 and is only being accentuated by COVID-19. And I think that's fairly self-explanatory. I want to dig a little bit deeper into the stuff that I've been teaching and writing about and consulting about for the last decade, roughly. And that all relates to what I said earlier about the economy generally, that digital technologies are tearing down geography as a major determinant of where you get your services and where you get your labor and where you get your customers from. And that's going to profoundly affect government in much the same way. And it's going to enable people over the course of the next decade or so to choose their own governments. Now, this sounds kind of absurd because we tend to think of government as being wholly territorially rooted. That's not historically the case, like just about everything else that we're talking about today. It's a relatively modern phenomenon. Government has been tied specifically to geography only since the Westphalian treaties of 1648. So the nation state as we think of it today is a pretty modern development. It's not rooted in nature. It doesn't have to be that way. And I think it's less likely to be that way in the future. And we're already seeing it fraying in a lot of ways. The best example of this idea that government won't be territorially moored and that people will be able to choose governments the way they choose their cola brand is the country of Estonia, which a lot of you probably know a good amount about. Estonia has been kind of the poster child for internet use in the last couple of years. They announced a new program several years ago called e-residency that I wrote these pieces about. And as a result of that, the Estonian government asked me to come over and visit for a week and meet all their people who were behind all this stuff. And I mean, it's a really fascinating place we could spend the entire hour talking about just in and of itself. Practically the entire country is computer literate. Children are taught coding from the age of 3. Everything is online. The entire economy is online to the extent that it takes 5 minutes literally for 95% of the population to fill out and file their taxes, because every economic transaction is electronic and fed into a giant database that then spits out exactly what all your income and deductions are. And all you have to do is run through it really quickly on your own personal blockchain portal, and then hit send, and your taxes are filed. So it's a really interesting country in terms of the direction of government services because of internet usage. But what interests me about it is they decided a couple of years ago that there's no reason that because of the reach of the global reach of the internet, they couldn't be providing government services to anybody anywhere. And they started this e-residency program, which essentially is a 21st century version of Delaware. You can have your business in Estonia without ever setting foot there, having no physical presence, having no employees, but you're virtually a Estonian business, which subjects you to the business regulation and tax system of Estonia. The main advantage of that is it then gets you into the EU, and it generates a lot of money for Estonia that way. But if you talk to the Estonians, they'll say, okay, we don't want to say this out loud because we don't want to get Russia and the United States angry at us, but major nation states are dying. This is the future. You can provide not just regulatory services and tax services virtually, but you can provide virtually every government service online to people who have nothing to do with the country, and essentially market yourself to citizens outside the country. And in fact, stuff like that is already happening in a internet fashion, and the internet is only going to accelerate it. There's a union of a dozen Caribbean countries that allow you to buy into each other country's social security system if you prefer another country's to your own. The Nordic countries are competing with each other for postal delivery within each other's own countries. So there are lots of ways in which government services are already starting to cross physical lines and be available to people all over the world. The internet, as Estonia is demonstrating, is only going to hasten that. If you can buy your government service from any country, any place in the world, there's no reason why you have to be buying that service from a government. You can be buying it from a business. In fact, lots of businesses throughout history have provided government-like services or governance services, and that's still true today, and it's just going to multiply in the future. These are just the examples of some of them. Blackwater's up there for obvious reasons. The United States military has outsourced a great degree of our national security to private military companies. Mercenaries go back about as far as human beings, but they're increasingly taking on the role of the national military for lots of countries around the world, including the most powerful country on earth, the United States. The Girl Crying in the Middle is a company I find kind of interesting. They provide consular services privately for profit. They're basically the equivalent of the State Department and the Marines to get you out of trouble anywhere in the world. And of course, that kind of service has long been available to very, very wealthy people. Thanks to technology, it's becoming lower cost and more readily available to everybody else. Same is true of virtually everything else that's on here. We've got displayed examples of parks, tax collection, intelligence gathering, currency, and judicial systems, as well as public safety, all of which are being provided by private companies nowadays. So I've argued for a long time that essentially businesses are in the government business, and the government is a form of business as well. So it really requires you to think seriously about what is a government if businesses can do government and governments act like businesses. So I started arguing in my classes about 10 years ago that Facebook was actually a government, a form of government. And people wouldn't believe me until Mark Zuckerberg came out himself about 2 years ago and announced that Facebook, in fact, is a form of government. The founder of Reddit and various other internet sites have said the same thing about their companies, and I think that they're right. Facebook more recently has announced that they're starting their own court system, they're starting their own currency. So the differences between what's a business and what's a government are declining in lots of ways. The line has been less black and white in the past, and it's becoming more so now thanks to technology. Some people think that that's wonderful because we all know governments are inefficient, and lots of people don't like government. So the idea that governments are going to have to give way to private sector enterprises strike a lot of people as a wonderful thing. I don't have a problem with the concept in general, but I do think that there's one particular sticking point that we need to think about, and that's public goods. And the issue with public goods is that they're basically the reason why we have government, and this goes back, of course, to Greek democracy. If the main problem with public goods is that you can't, by definition, you can't exclude people from getting the benefit of them, which means that if they don't have to pay for it, they won't pay for it, and they'll still get the benefits of living in an educated society, of having a public health infrastructure or public safety infrastructure, or any of the other public goods that are pictured on this page. So if you don't force people to pay for public goods, i.e. you create a government that requires people to pay taxes, they won't. And then these things that we basically need in order to operate cooperatively go away. At least that's been the theory for the last 2,500 years of essentially why we have governments, to require that people pay for public goods and not be free riders. I'm increasingly convinced that the technologies that are undermining geography and therefore undermining governments as we know them today are also making it possible for things that we would think of as not governments to provide government services going forward. And this slide lists a discussion of those. The one thing that isn't on here that should be on here is the problem I just mentioned of free riders. The gated community nature of internet services means that you can achieve everything that's listed on this slide: lower marginal costs. You can get digitize and gain the benefit of the externalities that otherwise result from public goods, but you can also exclude the people who aren't choosing to sign in and take advantage of it. One of the areas where we're already seeing this is on our roads, where access to the roads is increasingly controlled by whether or not you have Easy Pass and are paying for the system in advance. And if you're not, you actually cannot get onto the Mass Pike now, and various other roads are going in this direction. That's a metaphor for what we're going to be seeing about government services worldwide in lots of other areas going forward. If you don't pay, you're going to be technologically excluded from the government service. Once you have that, you can have the technology instead of what we think of as government that basically controls the free rider problem and provides public goods. I'm going to run through real quickly an example here of a business idea I've been working on this. Essentially, what this slide shows is that the taxpayers have a certain level of resentment nowadays in most governments. So they pay for services that wind up in benefits that are diffused throughout the society, and they don't necessarily see the benefit themselves, at least directly and monetarily. If you set up an investment model, you can in fact make it possible for people to capture the economic benefit of what they're investing in through their taxes and see a return on it. This is the business name that we're working under, Virtuous, or Virtue.us. The example that most people can grasp readily is higher education. We basically know that giving somebody a college education provides about $1 million more in income over the course of their lifetime. There are plenty of statistics on that. You can set up a model where an investor pays for the education and reaps the benefit over that over time from that, in the same way as you have over a mortgage. And there are increasing numbers of providers who are doing this sort of thing. My argument would be that the same sort of economic arrangement would work with lots of other human services, allowing what are essentially companies to provide what are essentially government services in a way that benefits investors. You might think that these kinds of services that I have listed here, that are, we basically think of government doing because you can't make money on them, are things you can't make money on. But if you crunch the numbers, the return on investment on all of these things comes out to be fairly equivalent to the higher education investment example, which everybody gets. For instance, the provision of 3 years years of daycare to a low-income single mother results in her income over her lifetime rising by $500,000, about half of what you get from an investment in a college education, but at lower cost. You have essentially the same ROI for all of these things that we think of as social services, but essentially can be business models, and the technology makes it possible for them to be business models. So I'm going to wrap up by saying, what does all of this mean for democracy? This was the title of a piece that I wrote right after Brexit in 2016. I think the important words in here are as we know it. Around about this time, 2016 through 2017, there started to be a spate of books about how democracy is dying, authoritarianism is rising, we need to guard against this. And there were, of course, elections around the country where right-wing, populist, authoritarian, however you want to describe them, leaders were elected in a large number of countries. And there was a general feeling that democracy is losing across the world. That too is a kind of long-term phenomenon. The voter participation has been dropping in virtually every country over the last 20 to 30 years. But I don't think that's necessarily the end of democracy. In fact, what we're seeing nowadays is a great rise in democratic activism in virtually every country around the world. And there's a struggle between authoritarian government and democracy, but we're seeing the same thing in the marketplace. There's an increased concentration and authoritarianness of a lot of the leading companies and industries today. But as I mentioned early on, the digital technologies today are essentially democratizing technology, and we're seeing a wave of democratization with a small d, the likes of which I don't think the world has ever seen before. So it's not a one-way sort of thing, but I believe we're living in a great age of democratization in lots of ways. Now, what does that mean politically? I think the best way to think about it is this map of two different U.S. presidential elections. They had largely the same result. In both of these elections, the Democrat won against the Republican candidate by 2% of the popular vote. You have essentially a country that is split down the middle in terms of its vote between the two presidential candidates. The one on the left is 1976, Carter versus Ford. The one on the right, pretty obviously, is 2016, Trump versus Clinton. Had Clinton gotten a couple of thousand more votes in just 3 places, in Philadelphia, in Wayne County, Michigan, and in the city of Milwaukee, she would have carried the Electoral College with over 300 electoral votes. You would have had essentially the same outcome in the Electoral College as well as in the popular vote as you had in the 1976 election. But the map would have looked the same. If Clinton were president today, you would have exactly the same map. It's just those 3 little dots, Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia, might be slightly bluer. But you have a completely different distribution of the exact same division of the population. It's almost 50-50 Democrat and Republican, but the map looks completely different. One of the reasons, of course, is, leaps out at you. The South used to be all blue. It's now largely red. But the real significance of the map is you can see blue and red intermingled across the country in 1976. You got lots of Democrats in North Dakota, South Dakota, Missouri, Kansas. You wouldn't see that today. You actually have lots of Republicans in California. You don't see that today. The country has segregated tremendously geographically. And a lot of that is for economic reasons. A lot of it is for lifestyle reasons. But what you have essentially is we don't really have active democratic elections in this country any longer. Your choice of what government you want is made by where you decide to live. If you want a certain kind of lifestyle and you want a certain kind of government, you live in California, you live in Washington, you live in Massachusetts or New York. If you want a different kind of economy and a different kind of lifestyle and different kind of government, you live in Nebraska or Oklahoma. Once you go to vote, the election is pretty much over. We know who's going to win virtually every state. So democracy as an electoral process is essentially behind us. Democracy is more of a market process now where people are choosing their government in advance of the elections. The elections are largely ratifying choices they've made as to where to live. The big part of the reason for that is it's a lot cheaper and easier to move today than it was 100 years ago. So people have moved to the governments that they want. What the internet does is make it even easier to move. It's practically completely cost-free. You hit a button and you can choose to have the government of Estonia or the government of Massachusetts or the government of Oklahoma, whichever one it is that you want. And so we'll increasingly see people choosing to quote unquote live under the government that they want and get their government services from the political entity that they want. This isn't just an American phenomenon. You see the same kind of geographical divisions in other countries as well, and they're intensifying, and people are segregating themselves into essentially, you know, politicized and lifestyle ghettos. The internet only makes that much easier, and it's going to accelerate and happen that much more. This is one other way of looking at it. This is obviously the world as seen at night. If we were all night in the same place, the world is basically split into two parts. If you look at the places that are lit up, they have largely similar economic systems, they have largely similar cultural systems, and they have largely similar politics. The same thing with the places that are dark. Rural Idaho and Yemen have more in common culturally and economically and politically right now than they do with New York or Singapore or Tokyo. So this is what the world is largely looking like these days. This is what the United States looks like. And you can see the map of what's lit up at night looks remarkably similar to the presidential vote by county. The main question is, are we going to remain together geographically, or are we going to split apart? I think we're headed towards something more like the latter here. So that covers about 50 different topics that we could spend an hour on each. And I've managed, I guess, to keep this to about a half hour. These are additional questions that I thought that we could talk about more in depth. And now, Dan, you can tell me how we're going to talk, since I can't hear anybody. And maybe this is you calling me. Is this you? Ah, okay. Yes, I can hear you fine on the phone. Okay. Okay, sounds great. Okay, I'm going to put you on speaker so I can put the phone down. Okay. Okay, shoot.
The first question is, the obvious issue with businesses increasing amounts of government mandate is who takes the role of regulating the businesses?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was a long, complex question. So let me see if I can think of a good answer for that. I mean, I think what we're asking basically is, if government regulation of business breaks down, then who's going to regulate businesses? And you know, again, I would draw an analogy to how we think about the political world generally. Not all governments obviously act in the public interest or are democratic. Some marketplaces are similarly democratic and responsive to the public will, and some are not. Facebook is a good example of this. I think Facebook is essentially right now where England was, you know, a year or two before the Magna Carta, and at some point, the nobles, if not the population as a whole, are going to rebel. There was a one of the great works of political science that nobody remembers now, the book back in the 60s called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And essentially said that for a political system to be legitimate, you had to have one of two things. You know, and this is basically what creates the loyalty to the system. You either have exit or you have voice, which means, you know, essentially that you have to have something that's democratic, that people have input into the forces that are controlling their lives, or they have to be able to leave it. And if you don't have one or the other, then you have illegitimacy, and eventually you have rebellion. I think Facebook has become a good example of this. Virtually the entire world is on Facebook. It is, for all intents and purposes, owned by one person, Mark Zuckerberg. You can wake up one morning and find that your privacy settings have been entirely changed by fiat of Mark. And that's been done a couple of times, and there's been something of a revolt over this. But the revolt only gets so far. There's a lot of complaining, but people don't leave Facebook because they don't see an alternative. There doesn't really exist an alternative. people are trying to develop alternatives, and I believe that these are going to emerge. When they do, Facebook will not be able to act in that fashion. This is true of a lot of other things. More and more of the marketplace is being monopolized by Amazon. Most of the 5 or 6 major tech actors are essentially monopolies that dominate their space. In that way, they're basically similar to a government. A government, for all intents and purposes, is a monopoly that, for one reason or another, you don't have the option of leaving. You have to take your service provision from it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it becomes democratic, but in the long run, I think systems that are not democratic it can only oppress people for so long before they revolt. So I don't think that's a satisfying answer for people who ask questions like that. They want to know that there is some kind of mechanism that is going to keep things in check. And of course, we've come to think of that as being government regulating business over the course of the last century. But I don't think that's historically the case. I don't think that's going to be the case in the future. There are systems that will allow for competition that by their nature will force those who run them to respond to the needs and interests of their customers, their workers, their citizens, their subjects, however you want to phrase it. But there are systems that inherently do not force that upon the leaders or the rulers or the owners, and they will be inherently autocratic and inherently anti-democratic in the same way that many governments are. Is that a satisfying answer? No. It's not a satisfying answer. It means that we're not going to live in some halcyon age where everything is wonderful and democratic, but we never have. But the struggle between autocracy and democracy, or between individual freedom and the forces of extraction and top-down management are going to continue as they have throughout human history, just in a different venue, through a virtual system that's more based on electronic connections, virtual connections, than on geographical connections. Yeah, I mean, that's sorry. Oh, that was the whole question. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. There's a Paul Krugman article today in the Times that addresses this in the COVID-19 context of is there something cultural about America that has led us to be far less effective in responding to COVID-19 than most other countries. And he tosses out what the general arguments are about something in our nature that's more individualistic, more paranoid, more distrustful of government and so forth, and he dismisses those and essentially says it's due entirely to Trump. I don't think that's entirely true, but there are Trump-like leaders elsewhere in the world that have been produced by somewhat similar political schisms and systems, and they've performed similarly poorly. For the most part, the countries, this isn't entirely true, it's not 100% correlation, but the countries that have responded best to COVID-19 have been smaller countries. The countries that have done the poorest, the United States isn't alone in this, China, Russia, Brazil, India is on its way down on this. The larger nation states are doing the poorest. Now, that may be cause and effect, or it may not be. It may be that that's a spurious correlation with other things that have to do with why the nation state is not functioning well in the current environment. It goes back to a lot of the polarization that's being caused by both the physical separation of people and the polarization that the internet, as it's currently constructed, tends to drive. So is there something peculiarly American about that? I would say yes and no. You look at the issue of income distribution, which has been, there's been a widening income gap across the world for the last 40, 50 years. This is true in every single developed country. It's not just true in the United States. However, it has been more severe in the United States for reasons that go to us culturally. So I would say that, there are cultural differences and therefore economic differences and political differences between the US and Europe and Asia. But the larger forces that are driving the world today are global and are the same everywhere. So you have some slight perturbations. And but there are general trends that are true worldwide about where we're headed. Well, yeah, it's more provocative to talk in extremes like that, but that's not entirely true. There was there's been a lot of reportage on. I mean, look, not all of Idaho is like that, and this is. There are 2 points in this. One is Boise is a lovely city and a wonderful place to visit, and they have really nice restaurants, and they've got a university, and it's a nice little community that's similar to a lot of other places. Tulsa is not a particularly good example, although it's trying to be. But the small cities in Missouri, Salt Lake City is actually, I think, one of the most European places in America. Omaha is a wonderful place. If you go back to that map, I can find that. Yeah, you look at the red states today. There's a little blue dot in each of them, and that's the main division in the United States, and in fact, in most of the world today. It's basically cities versus non-cities, or metropolitan areas against rural areas. They're very, very different economically and sociologically, and they have very, very different views, and they vote for very different candidates all over the world. So the Boises and the Omahas of the world and of the United States are really miniature versions and fairly similar in outlook to the San Franciscos or the Hong Kongs. The red places have very similar attitudes to red places elsewhere in the world. Now, rural Idaho and Yemen might seem like kind of an extreme comparison, except that rural Idaho is well known as a longtime home of extremists. And they've been identified as a threat for a long time by the FBI as a domestic threat. But in the last couple of years, with the globalization of communication and the rise of the internet and access to information and so forth, there's been a good deal of reportage on this, that the radical militant groups in Idaho have started to realize that they have a lot in common with the rebel groups in Yemen. And I'm not making this up, and I'm not speaking hyperbolically on this. They are in communication with each other because they realize that they have very similar goals and very similar worldviews. There's one basic difference. In one case, they believe in the Christian God. In the other case, they believe in the Muslim God. But they've found that if they just ignore that fact, they can make common cause over what their basic goals and tactics and motivations are. And they, in fact, are very similar in worldview and very similar in goals and very similar in practice. So it may sound kind of extreme to compare Idaho to Yemen, but it, in fact, is not. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, this, like all the questions, is a really good question, a really deep question that you can, spend days talking about. And unfortunately, I've got a couple of seconds to come up with an answer. The question is essentially, isn't government gaining more and more control over the internet, and won't the effect of that be the suppression of freedom generally, and also having a negative impact on cross-border trade as well as communication and affect global business and so forth. And I think that the answer to that is, in the short term, yes, having a negative effect. In the long term, less so, and probably more mixed, like kind of my answer to just about everything. Um, there's a conference I sponsor on these issues every year at Columbia University, and if you're interested, it's called the Greater Good Gathering, and you can find it online, greatergoodgathering.org. All one word, greatergoodgathering.org. The year before this one, in 2019, we basically were focused on kind of this issue about the internet. 20 years ago, everybody said the internet was going to, essentially bring about world peace and happiness and improve everybody's life, and we're all going to be friends, and we're all going to get along, and elderly shut-ins will have access to people that they wouldn't have otherwise. It's going to cure every known human ill. It's a wonderful thing. By 2018, everybody was saying that the internet is the death of everything good. It's bringing nothing but divisiveness and authoritarianism, and we're tearing ourselves apart, and isn't it horrible? And I think both of those things are true in a way, or were true at their time. The answer is probably going to, in the long term, be somewhere in between, because there's sort of a natural model where for everything that comes along, there's something that comes along that figures out how to prey on it. And then there's a defense that develops to that. And then there's another way of attacking that defense that arises, and things kind of evolve like that. And what we're seeing with technology a lot these days is kind of a mimicry of evolutionary biology, or the evolution of societies online in a period of years, as opposed to a period of millennia or eons. So there's an attack and defense kind of development in everything. Right now, it would seem, I think, to most observers, that authoritarianism and repressive regimes have figured out how to overcome what seemed to be the internet's early promise of democratizing and destroying all authority structures, and that we're now seeing an age of more repression. I think we're actually seeing, we're seeing all of this simultaneously. The Chinese government is figuring out how to identify and arrest protesters a lot more easily thanks to technology, and how to block it. But these technologies are still being used by protesters to organize in much the same way that they were being used in the Arab Spring, roughly a decade ago. And for every technology the authorities come up with to block the internet, somebody comes up with a way to route around it. And then, of course, the authorities come up with a new way to block it. And I think that kind of cat and mouse game is going to continue in a lot of ways. But, ultimately, successful systems survive and unsuccessful systems don't. The problem is, as Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. But in the long run, the system that works best is going to survive. And we may see, just like we might have seen 20 years ago, oh, it's going to be a wonderful age of, age of Aquarius thanks to the internet. Well, that ain't happening. It's possible that we could see an age of global depression where everything is horrible. But I don't think that's likely either, because human nature tends to respond to those sorts of things. We may see further authoritarian governments, although, as I said, I think there's a pushback on that, and that may negatively affect business. And the experiment we're seeing in this right now is Hong Kong. We're going to see live what happens when an authoritarian government decides it's more important to them to be authoritarian than to maintain the goose that laid the golden egg. There's been, in a very short period of time, a tremendous flight of people and capital from Hong Kong. That's going to continue as much as possible. I think if the Chinese get their way, they'll largely destroy Hong Kong, which will be to their detriment. In the long term, a government that functions that way is not going to run the world, because they're going to destroy their own economy. Now, in the short term, are the Chinese politically, militarily, and economically going to pose a challenge to us? Yes, obviously they do, and they are, and they will. But if you destroy international trade, if you destroy communication, if you destroy freedom, if you destroy innovation, you're not going to be a world leader militarily or economically forever. It may be for a long time, but probably with how quickly things change in the world today, not for very long. So, the short answer to your question is yes, it is having and will have a deleterious effect on business as the internet is becoming increasingly authoritarianized by governments as well as by non-governments. In the long term and the not so long term, I'm actually fairly optimistic about that because I just don't think systems like that ultimately work, and people will find workarounds economically, technologically, and politically, as they're already doing. Yeah. Yeah, repeating the question is actually harder than answering the question, I think. These are long and complex questions, but I guess I'd summarize the question as being, you know, essentially isn't the government, and the use of the phrase "the government" is what's really key to this question. Isn't the government going to become a dumb landowner that essentially is supplying physical things like roadways and hard infrastructure, including wire infrastructure, and that's more or less all it's going to do. That's how it's going to derive its revenue. And at this point, there's probably some part of that question that I'm missing, which had a lot of nuance, but I think that's kind of what it came down to. And the answer to that is yes, if you think of the government as the government, which goes back to the point I was making at the very beginning of this. I don't think government is going to disappear, but I think government is going to look different and have a lot of different forms, the same way as we're seeing in all kinds of other industries. There are some things that are going to be necessarily territorial and some things that don't have to be territorial. The bulk of what modern government became over the course of the last 100 years or so are things that government didn't used to do for the most part, and that governments don't have to do. Most advanced societies have decided they wanted government to do that for reasons that we discussed, going to the economics of public goods. But as the economics of those change, and it's possible for other entities that we don't think of as governments today to provide those kinds of services, they will be providing more and more of those services. So things that aren't government will be providing things that we today think of as government or governance. But the government, as a geographically tied institution, will still exist as long as people are corporeal beings that occupy physical spaces. But not all government is like that, and not all government will be run by the government. Some of it will be, be run by private companies or nonprofits or forms we haven't thought of these days. But I like to use my next door neighbor as a good example of this. We're one of the rare places where the blue and the red are right up next to each other. I'm a committed Democrat. My next door neighbor just absolutely loves Donald Trump. We have very different views on things, and 10 years from now, we can hit a button and choose to have a different government. I'll choose to live in the virtual Massachusetts, and he'll choose to live in the virtual Oklahoma. But we're not going to be able to do that about everything. We will do that about taxes that go to education and welfare systems. But we live in a township that currently doesn't have a sewer system. We have, in-ground, on-site sewer. There's a move by some people in the township to create a sewer system that would then, force us to pay taxes for and become part of the physical township sewer system. We have a road that runs by our street that, neither of us can get off our property without going onto this road. Lance and I are jointly going to have to make decisions in the future about what happens with paving the road and who's going to pay for it, about what's going to happen with the sewer system and who's going to pay for that. And we're going to have to make those decisions with our neighbors, because that's unavoidably local and physical. Things that are not unavoidably local and physical, which at this point is the majority of what we think of as government today, are not going to have to be made jointly by me and Lance, and they're not going to be. So, will government be a dumb landholder? In a lot of ways, yes. And what we think of as government, a lot of ways, no. And as one little icing on the cake, I will note that there is a reason why. There are a lot of reasons why, but there's a reason why that most people don't think about, but we will see historically why the United States of America elected at this point in history a president whose life is basically based around real estate management and marketing. And that is that's what the government's going to be left doing in the future. Sure. Right. Yes. Okay. And I'll try to respond quickly to the question. The question is, I said at the beginning that we're not seeing a disjuncture basically, but what we're seeing under COVID is that the future is happening more quickly. And as the question put it, we're not just seeing a movement from A to B right now. We're seeing a movement from A to B to C to D. Things are happening more quickly. So won't business have to be more agile? And the answer is yes. In fact, and this is itself a trend over the last several decades, if not over the last several centuries. Everything is happening faster. I guess if Bismarck went to Mecklenburg, he would only get a 10-year reprieve nowadays instead of a 50-year reprieve. Everything's happening faster. Everything has to be much more agile. Governments, in fact, too, have to be much more agile for lots of the same reasons, because they're facing the same pressures. So everything is happening faster. In general, because of COVID, a lot of things that were going to happen in terms of workforce trends, in terms of the adoption of distance technology, in terms of how that was going to affect various industries that I talked about, and the effect that it's going to have on government is happening a lot more quickly. I think that 6 months ago, if I had given the same talk and talked about how there was going to be widespread lack of faith in government in virtually every major nation state on earth, you might have thought, yeah, I can see the crack up coming. There's a lot of global tensions in the world today. Look at what's been happening since 2017, 2018, but that's a longer term phenomenon. In the last 4 months, public faith in government has melted down in every major nation state on earth. I mean, more quickly than you could have thought it was going to happen. So yes, everything is happening faster. Everybody's going to have to respond faster.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm gonna unmute myself now, Eric, and you won't be able to hear me, but I'm going to talk to the people on the thing and close the call. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
So everyone, I hope you can hear me. I'd like to thank Eric for an interesting presentation, very interesting presentation. Sorry about the technical difficulties, and thanks to everyone on the call for helping me work around those. Thanks to Eric also for forging ahead with the talk, which I thought was very interesting in spite of the technical difficulties. So thanks again to everyone. We're going to close the call. I have recorded it, and I will share that. Takes a little bit of time to process the recording, but I'll share that to everyone, with everyone who was on the call. So thank you. Thanks again to everyone, and I'll close the call now. Thank you. Bye-bye.